This is Michael Lester on Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live, www.rmb.org.au. Also syndicated on Geoff Menadew's email newsletter and his podcast. Our program is Community Voices. We're all living through a very tumultuous time globally as the world tries to shake down to a new international world order with the rise and ascendancy to economic power of China vis-a-vis the US, with big implications for all of us. It might be interesting to take a look at how we got to this point, particularly how China got to this point and what might be motivating it and the way it might behave. We're going to be discussing today its engagement, particularly in Eurasia and Central Asia, which might seem on first glance a side topic. Our guest today argues that the control and the security that China has sought in Eurasia, and particularly Central Asia, is in fact a hinge point, I think he calls it, in the move towards global supremacy. Our guest is Geoff Raby, with whom we've talked before on this program. Dr. Geoff Raby, Order of Australia for his services to Australian diplomacy over many years, 20 years, including as the ambassador to China, the Australian ambassador to China. He knows China very well, having lived and worked there. The book we're discussing, Great Game On, The Contest for Central Asia and Global Supremacy, by Geoff Raby and published by Melbourne University Press. Thank you so much, Geoff, for joining us again.
My pleasure, Michael. Happy to be here.
The proposition that the situation in Central Asia, Eurasia generally, is central hinge point to the developing struggle for global supremacy and a new world order, it seems a little off the agenda in some sense.
To the contrary, the dominance of Eurasia has always been a central theme in geopolitics. There's a big body of literature from the early 20th century, mainly associated with a geographer, Mackinder, from the UK, that argued that the country or the state that controlled the Eurasian island, as he called it, dominates the world. Partly that comes from just the very, very big numbers of people that are in Eurasia, the massive resource base, the energy endowment, and its geopolitical location, strategic positioning. You can argue the toss over whether that's Mackinder is really right, but as recently as 1997, the very famous geopolitical analyst and former national security advisor to Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in a very influential book called The Great Chessboard, argued that America must stay fully engaged in Eurasia and must retain dominance or preeminence there. Otherwise, another state, he did not mention China then, but clearly China has done this, another state will arise and be the dominant power of Eurasia, giving it the potential to be the global dominant power. And so what I argue is that China is well on its way to that position. And I draw an analogy, which I think is very, very interesting when you think about it, an analogy with the United States. At the end of the 19th century, the US eventually consolidated its territory within its borders of the United States. It saw off all threats to its borders, consolidated its position in the Western Hemisphere, and by the early 20th century became the Western Hemisphere hegemon. And that's basically remained the situation to today. From that time, once it established control in the Western Hemisphere, it was able to turn to project power globally. And that's precisely what the US did. So I argue that there is an analogous situation in Eurasia for China. For 3,000 years, you can argue about the exact timing, but forever almost, the Chinese state, in whatever form it was, empire or national state, it always had to secure its land borders, of which there's 22,000 kilometers of land border to defend. Most of that is in the Eurasian space. And so territorial land-based security has always prevailed over maritime security for China until recently. But over the last 20 years, China has increasingly consolidated its borders, established its security within Eurasia, and it's given it the capacity, and guess what? It's actually doing it, to start to project power globally and to look at maritime security. This is, I think, a key element that's been missed in the whole geopolitical discussion of the rise of China, is the extent to which China is now free to project power globally.
The struggle over Central Asia and Eurasia has certainly been a long one. Your title echoes the great original game in the late 19th century, where we had imperial power struggling, particularly Britain and the Russian Imperial. What do we learn from that struggle?
I'm a great fan of the great game played out in the 19th century and read a lot of the literature and travelled personally through many of the places that were key points of contest between Great Britain and Russia. But there are a lot of temporary echoes in the original Great Game. First of all, it lasted from, there's no precise dating of the start, but around the 1840s, 50s, right through to 1907. 1907 is a key date and cutoff because that's when the two great powers of Great Britain and Imperial Russia came to an agreement on the borders, established what's now known as the Wakam Corridor between the northwest frontier of India and Afghanistan. And then they basically gave up the contest. The thing about it is that the original Great Game was based on a supposed threat by St. Petersburg, Imperial Russia, to India. And for the 70 years or thereabouts that the Great Game was played out and involved constantly Great Britain being suspicious of Imperial Russia's expansion through Central Asia and the Far East and pushing back against Russia wherever possible. The reality is there is no evidence that St. Petersburg ever considered invading or occupying in some way British India. In many ways, it's resident of the China threat today. Everyone talks of the China threat. Politicians get excited. Newspapers put it on the front page with red arrows, pressing against Australia. But there's precious little evidence that there's any intent to establish a hegemony control over Australia by China or anyone else in the region. So it has that resonance. And then, of course, today what's happened is that whilst there'd been a long-run trend of China increasing its power over Central Asia relative to Russia, the Putin invasion of Ukraine has really accelerated that shift. And in many ways, it's brought forward the time when China's become the most influential, consequential, and dominant power across Eurasia. At the same time, China's ascendant power, which is challenging the US, and we now are in a position of great power competition. And the question then, and to your point about lessons that might be learned for the present, the question is whether China and the US can reach some peaceful accommodation in the way that Britain and Imperial Russia did in 1907 when the Wakam Corridor was established. So what happened in 1907 was that basically Britain and Russia just gave up the geopolitical contest because a third power had emerged, which worried both of them equally, and that was Germany, Bismarckian Germany. So they gave up the contest between themselves and saw that there was a new challenger to the order, and both started to look to Germany and how to contain Germany. So I think it points to something that's well worth policymakers considering, that the contest between an ascendant and a dominant power doesn't necessarily have to end up in conflict.
You say one of the lessons there is, and you refer to it in the book as Thucydides Trap, which is the tendency in history, it was argued, to see the rise of an emergent power as a threat that required war. But as you say, maybe one of the lessons there is that perhaps that isn't the only way out of these things. The other thing about the Great Game is it was described as the graveyard of empires. And of course, the Russians went into Afghanistan. And then, of course, we had America withdrawing from there. But the Russian approach about expansion and their approach to gaining security through their involvement in Eurasia and Central Asia, it's been a very different strategic approach, hasn't it, to, say, the Chinese?
Oh, absolutely, Michael. And thanks for bringing that up, because that's really a key element of the whole book. And that is that Russia, since the Mongol invasions of Muscovy and their defeat in the 16th century, has derived its security by expanding its borders and controlling more and more territory as basically buffer states. I have a chapter in the book quoting Vladimir Putin in 2016 when asked by a school kid during a school visit, where does Russia end? Putin responds, Russia ends nowhere. It's a state based on unlimited expansion, and that's where it derives its security. In the case of China, China seeks to have tributary states. It doesn't seek to occupy and conquer them, but it wants deference from them. And I think there's a contemporary analogy to that. People think tributary state, you're sort of having to make payments to China or transfer wealth or transfer allegiance or whatever. In the past, in the imperial times in China, often the ambassador who came to the imperial court bearing gifts for the emperor went home with gifts of far greater value than he brought. It was the act of gift giving rather than the value which mattered to the imperial court. And today I don't want to stretch the analogy too much, but it's just a thought that I am serious when I say that what the Communist Party wants is simply to be left alone. The Communist Party wants to make a world that's safe and secure for the Communist Party. And in many ways, that's like the imperial order, a world that basically recognized the legitimacy of the emperor. That recognition of legitimacy gave the emperor within China the right to rule. And so I think there's a lot of sort of strange historical references here, but it is a very fundamental, different approach to security. And ultimately, in my view, brings them, Russia and China, into contest, into potential conflict.
We might see that played out in Central Asia, as you describe in your book, in what's happened to the Central Asian Republic. On the one hand, when they were part of the Soviet Union system, and latterly where they've come under the influence and the security interests of the Chinese. Again, the approach to these Central Asian states has been very different, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. For a while, there was an equilibrium, if you like, in Central Asia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Increasingly from the 2000s, Russia provided basically security, trading arms, support for security services and the militaries. And so Russia looked after the security of Central Asia, and the Central Asian states liked that very much. And China, with its ever-increasing economic weight, provided the commercial and economic opportunities, the investment, the infrastructure bill from 2013 with the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. But very much in the post-Putin invasion of Ukraine, that equilibrium has fallen apart. And the invasion by Putin of Ukraine has had a number of ramifications in Central Asia. First of all, it's absolutely weakened Russian military presence and capacity. It's seriously damaged Russia's security image. It has called into question Russia's capacity to actually provide security in Central Asia. And it's opened up space for China to start to do more and more on the security side in Central Asia. Also, and I think this is very interesting development, there's an increasing questioning amongst elites in Central Asia of the old imperial Russian and Soviet colonial past. Because these states were colonies. Under the Tsars, they basically were left alone. They spoke their own languages, dialects and things like that. Only the elites learned Russian and looked towards St. Petersburg. Under the Soviets, they had to actually be part of the whole Soviet state, and their languages were suppressed. Everyone had to speak Russian broadcasts and television and radio and so on. And there's a great resentment building up against that. And so, if you like, Russian soft power, which was so essential for Russian influence in this part of the world, is starting to come into question. And again, China is very keen to fill whatever vacuum may be created.
There's been a lot of anxiety, as you call it, in the West about the concept of Chusia. Is it? This is a combination of China and Russia. This idea, which is seen as an alliance of autocracies, and I think there's even Putin spoke recently of a friendship which lasts. What is the origin of that sort of relationship, and where does it stand at the moment? It's quite a brittle relationship as of now, isn't it?
Well, I would argue so very much. And briefly, I would say that the things that divide China and Russia are far, far more significant than whatever unites them. It isn't based on ideology. It isn't based on shared economic interests. It's not even based on how they engage with the international community. It's largely based on a very sour attitude that both Putin and Xi Jinping have towards the West, and particularly the United States. Now, there's certain reason for that, because the United States, always lives in hope of regime change in both China and Russia. At least it has until Trump. Trump could be quite different on this, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in a minute. So there are great historical divides. There is this point we were discussing, which is very fundamental, a different approach to security. I spent a lot of time in the book looking at the Russian Far East, as we know it. It was once Manchuria, or a big slab of Manchuria, because under two treaties in the 19th century, the 1858 Treaty of Ajun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking, or Convention of Peking as it's properly known, Russia took all the land north of the Amur River from basically Siberia to Sea of Japan, and then under the Convention of Peking, all the land east of the Ussuri River to also to the Sea of Japan. So basically, over 1 million square hectares were lost to China with these two unequal treaties, as China used to call them. Russia is the only state not to have returned 1 kilometre of land to China that was ceded by China under the equal treaties. Now, the British, the French, the Americans all have returned land that China lost under unequal treaties. So this is it's not spoken about at present. That's the last thing Xi Jinping would want anyone talking about in China. But occasionally bloggers pop up and say, well, look, President Xi, if you're really going to achieve the rejuvenation of the nation, you're going to have to get all this land back from Russia. Now, recently, just last year, a decree came out from Beijing saying that all maps in China have to refer to cities like Vladivostok by their pre-Russian name, their original Chinese names. So since 1858, Vladivostok's just been transliterated into Chinese, but there was a prior name to Vladivostok before it was ceded to Russia. Now all the maps have to show that. So I think that tells you something about how these issues are not going to go away. Swept under the carpet for the time being, for sure, but these are things that fundamentally divide the interests of China and Russia, and also lead to continuing mistrust of each other.
One of the other issues, you certainly talk about the triptych of the security border issues with Manchuria, Mongolia, and Xinjiang. Now, Xinjiang's an interesting case in point. While on the one hand, Afghanistan, the center of the Great Game, was central to Central Asia, if you like, geostrategically, so is Xinjiang in many ways, and historically in the town of Kashgar. What's the story that you tell about the situation with Xinjiang and the Chinese approach? Because, of course, they're faced with one of their concerns to domestic security, which is terrorism, in this case in the form of Uyghurs and Islamic terrorist threats.
Yeah. So the chapter on Xinjiang in the book is the longest chapter. For me, it contains just amazing, fascinating stuff I didn't know till I started researching and reading deeply into the subject. But briefly for your audience, look, Xinjiang was only incorporated into Qing Imperial China in the mid-18th century. It was always borderlands, always fluid borders, people moving pretty much freely in and out of Xinjiang, culturally dissimilar to the Qing. They were the Uyghurs, for example, a Turkic people. 40% of the language, I think, is common with Turkish. Imperial Russia always had designs on Xinjiang and believed it should be part of the Central Asian colonies. Britain was very fearful that Russia might succeed in this, and the Great Game was played out very much from Kashgar in the southwest corner of Xinjiang, where today there are still the original consulate buildings from the 19th century where the Great Game was actually conducted during the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century. It's Islamic, it's culturally in every way connected much more with Turkey and looks much, much more west than the rest of China. Even its music, the music is common from the Middle East, North Africa, all the way to Xinjiang, and then suddenly it stops at the eastern border of Xinjiang, and it's Chinese music. It's completely different. So it's fascinating. And there's a great story, if you bear with me for a minute, Michael, I tell in the book about Khanate of Kashgaria, which was established by a Khan called Yakim Beg, who came over from what's now roughly, it's a Fergan Valley, roughly Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan border area. And he established his own Khanate in the 1860s and even had an embassy in London. both Britain and Russia were supplying him with arms, competing for his support as part of the Great Game. And he also trading, balancing all the great powers, which the current Central Asian states are doing today as well. He recognised the Sultan of Turkey as the suzerain of the Khanate and had the Sultan's face on the coin, and Friday prayers always acknowledge the suzerainty of the Turkish ruler. So fascinating story. It lasted for about 16 years. And then the Qing made a hugely significant decision to reconquest Xinjiang, take it all back. It was a massive effort. It was hotly debated in Beijing. By this stage, there was a school saying we have to worry about maritime security. And here's the thing to try and understand how essential Xinjiang is to Beijing's own sense of security. One school arguing for maritime security, another school saying that if we lose Xinjiang, we lose Mongolia. There goes Mongolia. Beijing falls. It was like a domino theory on the frontiers. And the frontier security people prevailed. China lost territory on the east, on the coast, to European powers. The Qing put all of its resources into the reconquest of Xinjiang, and Xinjiang's now been formally part of the Chinese state ever since. It just goes to highlight how tenuous Beijing's grip has been until recently over Xinjiang, how Xinjiang has a very critical fulcrum in the whole of Central Asia. And now, with the return to power of the Taliban in Kabul, Beijing again feels threatened by emergent Islamic terrorism and fundamentalism spilling over from Afghanistan. And there are terrorist groups in Afghanistan, such as ISK, the Islamic State of Kyrgyzstan, that has an ambition to establish a Khanate in Central Asia, of which Xinjiang is to be part. And they operate in Afghanistan, and they have a base on the border with China. So these threats are real. Whether they are as great as Beijing imagines, it all basically is a continuation of that whole issue of, or story of frontier security, which the book tells.
Nevertheless, Geoff, your basic proposition is that China has now moved, certainly within Eurasia and Central Asia, to be the stable dominant power in Eurasia, obviously, and particularly vis-a-vis Russia, given recent developments. It still has its insecurities, but in terms of concerns about the developing world order and China and Russia getting together, as you say, that whole concept has feet of clay, and you say that there's a fundamental conflict and tension baked into the DNA of the two different approaches that we've discussed, China and Russia, to the security, that suggests that's not going to happen. So I guess that leaves us with this question of what the approach is going to be towards China in developing this new order. You're saying now that it's going to reach out beyond its borders into a global regime, if you like, but do this, I think you say, by osmosis rather than territorial acquisition or changing political systems in these other countries.
A couple of things there. I think, first of all, everyone acknowledges now that we live in a multipolar order. When I wrote my last book just 4 years ago, it was almost risque with me saying that the old unipolar moment had gone and we lived now in a multipolar world. I don't think anyone would argue with that proposition. And you see it in, the inability of the US to get its way in Gaza, or constant conflict on the Eastern Front in Europe. Things have changed, but also what I outlined in my last book, but its lines were only hazy 4 years ago. I think they're much sharper now. And that is a world of bounded orders. A bounded order where Australia, for example, sits under US leadership of a sort of Western order, definitive. There are some countries from the global south in this as well, and a Chinese-led order, which is predominantly global south. And you see that China has been quite successful in building institutional structures around it. The most recent example is the BRICS meeting in Kazan, where 23 heads of state went to Russia for the meeting, and another 40-odd states have indicated that they wish to join. So it's got a very long tail of aspirant members. So I think the order is this bounded order. It's not blocks, and there's lots of crossover and plenty of capacity for the blocks and for China and Russia as the leaders of those blocks to compete as they do, to compete, but also to cooperate as they do on issues in the global commons, climate change, asymmetric terrorism, asymmetric security such as terrorism, international crime, and so on. But yes, China now, having secured its interior borders, has the capacity to project power globally. It is and will continue to project power globally. I don't think China would be a hegemonic power. It's not going to sort of try and occupy Australia. Many reasons for that, but mainly practical reasons, frankly. But as I described China in my last book, I see China as what I call Prometheus bound, a constrained superpower. And it's constrained by lots of things, less so by its borders. It has 22,000 kilometres of land border to defend, but they are much more secure now, as I write. But the fact it's still an empire. It's got unresolved territorial issues inside its borders, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong. But more than anything else, and unlike other great powers, China is utterly dependent on world markets for everything it needs. I mean, in the case of Russia, Russia is a hydrocarbon economy, but it's got a high degree of self-sufficiency inside its borders, should it choose so, and the financial means through sale of hydrocarbons to do that. China is deeply integrated into global supply chains, deeply dependent on countries like Australia for raw materials to keep itself going. So I don't see a hegemonic China emerging out of this, but obviously a China that is very influential and will be a significant factor shaping international relations.
Leaves the question of Russia that for so long has preoccupied the West in terms of world orders, but Russia seems to have dealt itself out of the game, and China seems to have, as you say, assumed the stable dominant power in Eurasia, long contested with Russia. It does leave the question what will happen with Russia. We can park that aside. There are various strategies that could be talked about there. How does this sort of two-bounded order differ from, what some people might yearn for as traditional, I think you call them Westphalian system of balance of power between competing states? Is it a different sort of world order we're looking at here?
Very good question, Michael. No, not really. I think within that order, we're going back to a world of Westphalian balance of power. And with that, I'd like to actually go back to the earlier point you made about what we do with Russia very quickly. The book ends by saying that it's unstable to have dominant China in Eurasia and it not being balanced in the Westphalian sense. So how do you balance China? Possibly the US is always going to be important in the Pacific, but to the extent that Trump takes his bat and ball and goes home, the US may be less engaged in balancing China, less interested in balancing China. What do you do about this? And I conclude really with a recommendation for Europeans and say that the Europeans must start planning now for a post-Putin world where, out of necessity to balance China, not out of goodwill, not out of anything other than brute Westphalian logic, they need to re-Europeanize Russia, bring Russia back to Europe.
We're closing here with our guest, Geoff Raby. We're discussing Geoff's very thoughtful and amazing grand sweep of geopolitical history. His book, The Great Game On, The Contest for Central Asia and Global Supremacy. Let's hope that the world, too, in moving towards this two-bounded order that you're talking about, doesn't fall into the trap that you've described and relates back to our experience in Central Asia, namely the Thucydides Trap, where we see this emerging global power basically only inevitably being able to be confronted by war.
I think that's the least likely of the outcomes. Plenty of examples, as I've said in this conversation, of the dominant power ceding strategic space to the ascendant power, that the consequences of war in the atomic nuclear age are so horrendous. I think that's most unlikely. And there are plenty of points between where we are today and that could be settling points for the new order.
Thank you very much, Geoff Raby, for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.